Please give a warm welcome to composer Benjamin Wallfisch. Supervising sound editors Oliver Tarney and Rachel Tate. Production designer Molly Hughes. And editor James Wilcox. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad you guys are here. James, I'll start with you. When I introduced the film, I mentioned that Ron was here back in July, and we talked about the film. And he kept mentioning that the anatomy of a miracle was the North Star for him, and that he told you that. Can you tell us what that meant to you?
I remember it very vividly. First time he mentioned it to me, I was sitting in a parking lot because I was going shopping for something, and he calls me, and completely, I'm at the mall, and he's like, "James, this has got to be about the anatomy of a miracle." Okay. And then I started deep diving into it and learning about the Thai culture, the spirituality of it all, the complexity of what that meant. And it's really not just one miracle. It ended up being 13 miracles. Mm-hmm. So
the film is extremely suspenseful. I mean, some of us have seen documentaries about the subject matter or were glued to the TV when it was happening. But your editing is able to build suspense on a story that some of us are familiar with. Tell us about building suspense on something that we already know the outcome.
I think that was the challenge. The ultimate challenge was to be able to tell the story and hold the audience and keep them engaged. And a lot of that meant not really, eliminating a lot of the redundancy. Had a lot to do with it. And once we established the geography of the cave, once we established where the boys were, once we established how difficult it was, we could easily skip chapters as we went along. So I think anytime you know the outcome of a film, that becomes the challenge. How do you, and there's reveals along the way. There's lots of information that no one ever knew. So I think that really helps engage the boys. And honestly, a lot of people, they were foggy on the actual details of the story. Mm-hmm. They knew that the boys kind of got out. They knew that the coach got out. Some people remember Elon Musk was involved. Some people remember someone died. But how they actually got the children out and their coach, no one knew because they sent the media away. Mm-hmm.
The first 14 minutes, you corrected me, I told you 10 minutes, but it's actually 14 minutes of the film are in Thai language and different slang and different other languages. How challenging was it from your vantage point? You don't speak Thai, and you're putting together 14 minutes of Thai language.
Well, after I read the script, I thought, okay, this is going to be my biggest challenge. How do I, a person who does not speak Thai, begin to work on this film? So I went out and tasked my editorial team with, please find a Thai assistant editor or a PA or someone that we can bring into the department to help us culturally and with the language and perhaps with the dialect, because the boys were from northern Thailand. So we ended up not being able to find someone, because when I got to London, it was completely in lockdown, so our resources were limited with reaching out to the Thai community to find someone. But what we ended up doing was phonetically breaking down the script, using several translators, Google Translate, and then subcapping every one of the scenes, because Ron was very interested in a natural approach to the film, which meant a lot of ad-libs. So my assistant editor, Simon Davis, who is an organizational genius, he had it all figured out. And by the time I sat down to cut, I knew exactly what they were saying, and then I began to develop an ear for the language. And the most important thing was this, that whatever they were saying in Thai, I really needed it emotionally to land, whether you spoke Thai, Spanish, German, whatever the language was. It just, the emotion became universal.
And tell us about the importance of 14 minutes at the beginning of the film that is actually Thai. You know, this is It's Ron Howard's an American production, British actors, Australian actors, but the heart of the movie for 40 minutes, we're listening to the Thai culture.
Yeah, I think that's one of the unexpected elements when you kick off the movie is that it's completely in Thai as you know it, and subtitles, and so you don't really fully expect that. And I think that landed us in that authentic zone to be like, oh, this is different, you know, Ron Howard. And we were really conscious of sort of Western filmmakers telling this Thai story, this Asian story, and specifically these boys being from the North, that added even another layer to it. So, you know, that's the approach that we took, was authenticity 100% throughout the film. We didn't really want to feel like we were manipulating the audience or this was the Hollywood version of this story, because the story's been told from a couple of different ways. There's been a documentary, and there was another movie made earlier on, even before the documentary. But that was the thing that Ron stressed a lot, was authenticity.
Mm-hmm. I gotta ask you about the underwater sequences. There is almost this otherworldly aspect once we start going inside and seeing it from the point of view of the divers. You know, tell us about your approach of the editing those underwater sequences.
Yeah, that was probably after I got an ear developed for the language. I think the next biggest hurdle, in addition to balancing all the different factors that were going on during the rescue, was the underwater storytelling, because it absolutely had to make sense. You don't have the use of dialogue to hang your hat on, to go, oh, I know exactly what they're saying or what's being communicated here. It was all through the dive, that sort of like unspoken dialogue that they use underwater, and just the whole idea of if the Thai divers went to a certain point, they had a red line, then the UK divers took over, they tied a blue line, so there was a lot of underwater storytelling. And the thing that I was most concerned about is, were we being clear, would we understand it? Because Ron was shooting in Australia, and I was cutting the picture in London, and that meant, I told him, I go, Ron, I really need you to look at these cuts on the weekends. I know you're swamped, but you have to look at these cuts, because I don't want you to come back to London and think we can manufacture this in the cutting room. It has to be done on location.
And the importance of, I never lost track of who the diver was. I could see their the face of them. You know, tell us about that.
Yeah, well, that was one of my big concerns, is clarity with who was doing what, and identifying the divers and identifying the children. Because underwater, once you put those masks on, it would be really difficult if you didn't understand who was the lead diver, which diver was doing what, which diver rescued which kid, and the whole thing. So a part of my method was to pretty much use close-ups to familiarize the audience with, yes, Viggo Mortensen wears the orange reddish helmet, Colin wears the white one, and then later on, Joel Edgerton comes in, he has a white one, one has stripes on it, the other one does not, but that dive recognition was super, super important as we go through, and you know, you're starting to cut to points of view, and you have to just know who you're looking at all times, and I think we were pretty successful with that.
You tell us in titles that we're day 1 and it goes until, you know, day 18. And I noticed that the titles keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger as the movie progresses. Can you tell us the logic behind that?
He is on it. I love that. Well, that was just to emphasize the importance of every day. Because when the story first broke, it really wasn't a big international story. I think locally, the Thais thought, okay, the boys are lost. We'll go in. They'll be huddled in a corner somewhere. The parents will smack them around. What are you guys doing in the cave? It's supposed to be at the birthday party. Get home. And they went in there, and the only thing they could see was the bikes. So day 1, as it progresses all the way up through day 10, you begin to see the growing concern, the importance, and then the graphics, the growing size of which day it was reflected that.
Pretty cool. Molly, when I introduced the film, I mentioned that the caves were built. The dam system was also built. Can you tell us, I mean, building caves, the little I know about filming in caves is that it's really hard to do. Can you tell us about about that.
Yeah, so we did. It was sort of a two-part approach because there's the exterior cave, which we had to build with the stairs going up at the site where the base camps are. And then that's a different approach than the interior caves. There's the underwater tunnel system, which is another approach as well. So I think we sort of designed the tunnels around events that Ron wanted to focus on, whether it's Semon's death or Chris getting lost, or there was a rock collapse, or someone getting stuck in the U-bend. Those events, we sort of worked backwards with storyboards from those events, and then it all sort of fell into place that way. So, and then when you're designing caves, it's really no different than designing architecture. I mean, instead of archways and windows, you have, crevices and fissures and tunnels that people have to get through. And we really had to think about it in terms of lighting also. So when you're designing a cave, it's dark, but we can't be in the dark. No one will see the actors. So you want architecture, you want interesting outcrops and shadows and deep places where people can be hidden, or the light can do funny things that people sort of, the light plays tricks on their eyes a little, and it's mysterious. So you sort of approach it the same way.
I almost felt like when we're going into the caves, that felt like a haunted mansion aspect. Was that something that you guys
It's so great. Yes, yes. When we first started talking about the film, there was, we talked about that. We talked about a haunted house or and creating suspense that way. And we talked a lot about what happens when a diver is alone, waiting, or sitting in a cave, and the light from their helmets bounces around the cave, and and your eyes sort of play tricks on you, and you think you see something that's not there. We talked a lot about that. So, as the cave also had so much spiritual context to the locals, which I don't know if that heavily ended up in the film. They do talk about it a little bit, but they really believe that the cave took the woman who was represented by the cave, the sleeping princess, took the children and would give them back when she was ready. So that's how all of these spiritual elements became involved as well, with people of different faiths and cultures coming to pray to the sleeping princess. So that layer of the spirituality and the mystery and mysticism is tied into the design of the cave.
The entrance of the cave, I noticed that every time they get out, we're able to see the lay of the land. Is that something that was historical accurate, or you built it so we could get the lay of the land?
Yeah, it's not like that in reality. So our cave, I wanted to build that way. There's a moment when Rick and John find the kids, and they come out with the video, and they hand it off, and they say, "Don't tell anybody." And by the time they come out, everybody knows. And I thought it would be great for them to be standing at the top of the stairs. And Ron and I talked about that information, literally seeing that information pass all the way through the camp. So the layout of the cave is designed for that, to be able to see up and see down what's happening all the time.
I'm not a water engineer, but when it came to the dam system, everything seems so, like I could understand the lay of the land with the sinkholes and everything that was happening. Was it, from your vantage point, building that and showing it to us, the fact that we needed to understand what was happening with the dam system?
Yeah, it was all very logical. I mean, that was really important to Ron. Again, sort of like we spent so much time picking masks, right, so that you could see the actors. That is in the same way, the geography was really important. These identifying markers, so that people would know where they were and not and sort of remain, connected to the progress that the divers took through the cave.
I think you mentioned a little bit about this, about the spirituality, but I noticed that there is, Buddhist symbols throughout the movie. Can you tell us about putting that in the design?
Yeah, it's interesting. When the first version of the script that I read didn't have a lot of that in it, and as we started diving into, there's so much reference, there's so many beautiful photographs everywhere online, and so as we started diving into those photos, we saw more and more photos of just people praying, or the bracelets, with the beads. There's a beautiful photograph that very early on I found of just like two wrists, like two people holding each other's wrists with these beautiful bracelets. And I sent that to Ron, and that was like a sort of a trigger point for us to dive into the spirituality of the cave itself and the people living around it. It was Buddhist, but then there were also more like folk spiritual stories and a culture in the area that particularly close to the cave in Chiang Rai that played into it too. So you have all these people showing up. You have Buddhist monks, but you have other people showing up with different prayer ceremonies that they're doing. There was this amazing ceremony that didn't make it into the film, but we did shoot it with nets, like people with giant, almost like fish nets, and we did some research and we talked to our Thai cohorts. We had so many Thai consultants on the film when we were shooting, and it was as if the nets were to try and, this dance with the nets was to try and pull the children out of the water. So that was this beautiful piece that we just discovered by doing research and diving in deeper with that.
Did you find that having all that, the fact that it was so well documented, you mentioned that there were so many photographs, was that an asset for you?
It was. One of the things we ended up doing is we had a plan laid out of the camp. So we had, as a location, we found this farm location that we graveled, and then we built the cave entrance and built the camp, the divers camp as we called it there, and then we had a road that we then built the main base camp with the structures that you saw, the governor's building and the building that the divers used as their sort of private base. We built those so all of that was together. So it was really convenient that way. I think that really sort of kept us on track.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Oliver and Rachel. When I first watched the film, I was struck by the fact that you have this outside environment, and it's contrasted by the interior sounds of the cave and the diving. Can you tell us about managing those two soundscapes back and forth?
Yeah, well, actually, Ron was really keen to have that as a yin and yang sort of thing, because when you're underwater, if anyone's been diving, you'll know that you hear a very MIDI kind of sound. There's really no top end or low end. It's all like in the middle like that. And at the minute we get outside, we can then fully give you the whole range of sound, all this crunchy, wet, sloshy sounds, and the scooters going by and the crowds. We can give you a whole ball of energy and life, and it, as well as being just different types of sound, it really emphasizes the amount of activity going on, thousands of volunteers just turning up completely off their own back just for the chance to see if they can save these boys. Nobody knows if they can. And then you contrast that, and the minute you go underwater, you see it's just very few people, it's their isolation, it's claustrophobia, and they're under all this solid rock, and it makes you feel all the more isolated. You know, there's all this activity outside, and for everything they can try and do, they can't be the ones to save the boys, and that really plays the two different worlds clash nicely, I think, and James's cutting helps.
And Oliver, I do know that, tell us about creating the underwater sound. I know that underwater sound travels faster. We don't use our eardrums.
I think, well, part of the thing that Rachel just mentioned there with the reduced frequencies, I think we sort of register sound through bone conduction normally. So that's why we have this reduced frequency. So everything had to sit in the sort of same band, but also because sound is traveling at 4 or 5 times faster than it does in air, we can't triangulate the source of a sound. So rather than even in an Atmos room, you know, where you can be pinpoint accurate normally and say, this is happening exactly there, this is happening, and the audience goes, okay, that's that event, that's that event. We wanted to have that authenticity. That was the early the Zoom call that we had with Ron, was like, how can we make this as realistic as possible? And so we took that away from the audience. So when you hear a sound, you aren't told instantly where it is on the screen, and it can at times become almost abstract, that it becomes a slightly interactive thing that the audience has to say, okay, that was that, rather than just being told, you know, instantly what it is. And I think that with the frequencies and the direction, that sort of, you've reduced one of the senses that we're just so used to relying on, which is sound, just going, okay, fine, I know everything that's in my environment, I know where it's coming from, I know what it is, I know that it's defined because it has that top end. We took that away from the audience, and so to try to basically give them some sort of sense of what it would have been like for those guys there.
And actually, they watched the film quite near the end, and luckily for us, they said it was pretty much as realistic as they've ever heard it. And we wanted to put you in their flippers, because to fully understand what they achieved, you have to be in their shoes, flippers, to get the enormity of what happened. You can't just hear about it, and if you feel it, it really brings another level to it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Tell us, both of you, the significance of breathing. And I don't think I'll have ever seen a film where the importance of breathing there is. I was aware of metered breathing, calm breathing, and that added to the suspense. I'm putting words in your mouth.
Sure. No, I mean, that was exactly this. It was a big thing. You can register who the divers are, but another layer of helping you understand who was the experienced cave divers who are used to that environment, knew to just not go burn through their air, and would not be so anxious going through these tight tunnels. So they would force themselves to have this very, very deliberate cadence to their breathing, whereas the Thai Navy SEALs, who were more used to open water swimming, absolutely there was an anxiety to their breathing that you would hear, so you'd know that they were struggling with that environment. There's also a narrative thing later on. Pretty much the only way that the divers who are taking this precious cargo back out,
The kids.
yeah, they've got to, that they can hear or register in some way that they're still breathing, you know, and that was the way they knew that they were still alive. You know, if they knocked the mask off or anything like that, that's pretty much it. So that was their way of making sure that the kid was still alive, and yeah, they're still on the journey.
And James, I'm going to bring you back in. How was it for you as an editor having to tap into all these nuances of sound as you're editing?
Well, when I read the script initially, I knew it was going to be an opportunity for a very sensory film. And, you know, just like Rachel said, the best way to really kind of get a hold of that is to be in the point of view of the divers. So early on, we had a Zoom call before we ever started, and I was making all these suggestions to Ron about hydroponic microphones and all these other things that would be wonderful to do, but they would slow down production. So we couldn't do it then. And then, you know, Oliver and Rachel had wonderful ideas about what we could do until we could like really manufacture that same feeling. So for me, it just felt like a unique opportunity to play with sometimes the absence of score. We didn't have dialogue underwater, of course, so there was storytelling that needed to happen, and all the sights and sounds of this tank scraping and just these guys hitting their heads, it just added to the layer of difficulty to get to these buoys, because there's all levels of diving. There's open water diving, there's night diving, wreck diving, and then this thing that they call sump diving and cave diving, which is going into these types of environments with literally almost zero visibility. And you know, we have to make adjustments creatively for the film because no one will be able to see anything once the divers were underwater. So I thought the whole film, that's part of the magic of it, I think, is that it takes you on this journey that's otherworldly, that most people in their lives will never experience what it's like to be in that type of environment. Most people may end up going on, even if they try going on vacation somewhere at some exotic island and they want to try scuba diving for the first time, it's going to be under a more controlled environment with lots of visibility and beauty and all of that. But this is completely its own thing.
Mm-hmm. Benjamin, I haven't forgotten about you. You in your score evades so many tropes. It's like the music is not this heroic music. You also don't do your typical suspense, tropes throughout the movie. Can you tell us about creating the difficulty of creating this unique score to the film?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a unique project, and it started like with James with a phone call with Ron about this idea of the anatomy of a miracle and the spirituality of the place, the customs of the local people, and of course, the minute I knew I was working on this movie, my go-to was immediately to start writing lots of suspense music and try and research a lot of traditional Thai music and make something very dramatic. And in the end, I didn't even present any of it to Ron because it was this emphasis on it had to come from the fabric of the cave. And actually the breakthrough was this, it just came from a conversation with Ron of why not have a voice for the cave itself? Why not give the sleeping princess a theme? And that was the starting point of the whole score. So Princess Nang Nong has a theme which actually you only hear in its entirety at the very end, in the end credits. It's a traditional song from the exact region, from the Chiang Rai region. And the song, it's incredibly beautiful. It's hundreds of years old, and it's about the idea of a river, the flow of a river being a metaphor for the flow of life, always moving in one direction. And that music, there's basically a rising fifth and a falling note, this da-da-da, which starts the song. That permeates all through the score, and the idea was to sort of turn it on its head and make it something quite malevolent and dark and terrifying. And this idea that the princess was angry. And so whenever you hear music underwater in the first half of the movie, it's very subtle. And as we go towards the moment of, we have no idea whether this plan's going to work, it sort of reaches this climax with the death we see, which is such an intense scene. And then everything kind of releases as we see the first boy being rescued. And that's when the score almost has permission to start being a piece of music. We were very subtractive in our process. And it was a very kind of workshop situation with James, Ron, and myself. We were meeting almost every day for about 3 months, just trying things. And in the end, it only worked if it felt like it was both of the place, but also of, like, not just the cultural place, but the physical, in the cave, the sound of air escaping canisters and scraping canisters turning into a rhythm, for example. And it was almost like walking a tightrope writing this score. There was only a very small range where it actually worked, and a lot of experimentation where things just were constantly not working.
Well, so to summarize, you incorporated underwater sounds like the oxygen tanks. You also incorporated Thai music, but I also heard British melodies for the British divers, correct?
Well, it was really important, definitely, to capture that international effort, and I knew we would be recording the orchestral elements in London. So I hired two wonderful soloists, a cello soloist and pianist Hugh Watkins, and also there are these incredible Thai soloists, Nat Bentito, our vocalist, and there was about 6 classical Thai musicians from Bangkok and from the region, and they both have equally important roles. So this idea of the musical analog to having the Navy SEALs and the British divers, we tried to capture that in the score as well.
Mm-hmm. Tell us the fact that the underwater part you had to score, and then also the outside world, did you, I just wonder if you thought of them as separate parts or a cohesive?
They actually were separate. It started off actually, Ron said, why don't we experiment making it almost feel like a horror score for the underwater scenes? And in the end, that didn't quite work, and we ended up with a sort of more sci-fi feeling where a lot of the sounds were just not acoustic in any way. And then you just have sort of solo instruments that come in here and there underwater, and then eventually the piano becomes the main voice with that scene with the white umbrella. And the piano almost sort of breaks the spell of the underwater music and gives it permission to include more human produced sounds in the score. And yeah, it's kind of where the princess has let go of her grip, and the score does the same thing.
It's a question to all of you. The fact that everything is subjective from the divers, you know, how did that affect that approach? How did that affect each of your departments? James?
Well, for me, I talked earlier about redundancy and eliminating redundancy, and it was amazing after our first screening how much the audience really grabbed onto and gravitated towards, that we didn't need to really hammer home a lot of the same points. And so there are 7 dives in the film,
right.
And in order to separate them and have them feel different, they needed to go in through actually that person's dive experience. So the first couple of dives where the Thai Navy SEALs go in, we see what it's like for them, and we hear what it's like for them. Then when Rick and John go in, we get to experience how far they made it before that rock wall collapses on them and they have to turn back. Ultimately, later, they bring in more help, and you see, if you notice in the film, you will see that nobody experiences the entry into the cave the same way. Yeah. That each diver that goes in there sees something different, and they need to hear something different. And to, like Oliver and Rachel's point, and Ben as well, we were trying to layer it and construct it and build it up initially, and then once we became familiar with some of the dives, like for instance with Simon's dive, which is completely different because he dies, he loses his life in that dive got deconstructed. So you hear him go in, you hear him struggle with the sacks that he's bringing, the wetsuits, and then he gets caught in a line, and you hear this frenetic kind of pace and score that like ratchets up underneath that. And then as he goes on, you see that he's lost his dive partner who's gone away. He starts this rapid accelerated breathing, and eventually he runs out of air. And it's very chilling to me. It's still probably the thing that gets to me the most out of how many times I've seen the film is when he finally sort of expires in the cave and those last bubbles go out, and then all you hear is just silence, which is like incredibly powerful. And the last thing that you hear is his tank scrape against one of the stalactites. So the film has a lot of different sonic design ideas throughout it, and that's what I think keeps the audience interested, is that you cannot ever anticipate what you're about to hear.
Mm-hmm. Molly, each diver, we get a little glimpse of their home. You know, Vigo, we get a little glimpse, and Colin Farrell, but we immediately understand who they are by what you show us. Can you tell us about creating those specific worlds?
Yeah, well, Rick Stanton's home actually looks like that. So, which was great for us. It was a great place for us to start. You know, just to show immediately their different personalities. And Rick is a loner, and John has a family, but he's separated from his wife, and his life is very organized and clean and neat and pretty spare. And Rick's life is more complicated and layered, and he has he's always working on something in his house. So his house is sort of his workshop. So that was really fun for us too. We were so fortunate because we had access to the divers, and they were, Rick was with us every day, and John was available on Zoom whenever we needed him. So it was great to be able to talk to both of them and really get to understand their personalities and then portray their personalities in their home environments.
Oliver and Rachel, I think James dived into, pun intended, a little bit on this, but the fact that once we're in the outside world, there's this cacophony of different languages being heard. Can you tell us about the sound design with that Tower of Babel outside?
Yeah, so 5,000 volunteers from 17 different countries, I think it was, turned up, and journalists as well as engineers and a whole load of people. And we wanted to not just fill the space with foreign languages, I wanted to get it right. And so we looked at proportional representation, really. We looked at the top, I think I recorded 10 different groups from different countries, the top 10, and if there were more Swedes, which there were, then French, then I recorded slightly more Swedes, slightly less French, and tried to, I was quite anal about it, really represent who was actually there. And then we researched technical terms. I looked into skedcos, which are those sleds that they come out. I know how to build a skedco now. We looked into, I looked into the GPS coordinates for where the cave is, so that when they're in the helicopter, the Thai paramedics can say their GPS when they're en route to the hospital, just everything. If we had military advisors, a Thai military advisor and an American military advisor, so any time you hear the radios going, they are accurately what they would have said, the right call signs. We just I didn't want anything exposed that wasn't completely as accurate as we could make it, because authenticity is the buzzword for this film, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, for all of us.
There's also that subtle thing of everything that you're hearing just above everything else is the narrative thing in that scene that you're meant to be, and the batons just keep getting passed between, whether it's one of the lead actors or it's a journalist or it's someone, there's always this baton being passed, and there's just information all the time.
Little weave,
Yeah.
sound weave.
I mean, visually, the parallel between the quietness and the noise is the same. The cave is very bright at the front entrance, and by the time you get to Chamber 9, where the boys are found, we were literally painting it black because there's no light in there. And I think by Chamber 3, we sort of had logic that by Chamber 3 there was no more electricity, because there were cables run in reality as far as they could into the cave, and that's as far as we went with it as well. And then when the divers come out and they come into this camp where there's 5,000 people, we have, tents, these brightly colored tents, and so many different colors and textures and smoke and food and rain and all these things, just kind of overloading your senses with the sound so that it all plays together.
And a lot of that sound actually was recorded in northern Thailand, in Chiang Rai, not far from the cave. So the northern Thai crowds that you hear, the local volunteers, they are people who live very near the caves. They're not some Thai actors from London that we rounded up. They really live up there, and they have the specific dialect. And we made sure all the Thai characters that are supposed to be from the north spoke that dialect. So they said it's kind of like, if you messed it up, it's like having a Texan in Nova Scotia. They can kind of communicate, but it's completely different. At different timings, everything. So we worked with voice coaches to make sure, I think 7, I won't tell you which one, 7 characters had to be either partially or totally re-recorded, and they were happy to do it, just to nail that dialect. And I heard today, in fact, that all the crowd that we shot up in northern Thailand, they all became friends, and all their families became friends, and tomorrow they're going to have a big outdoor screening on a big bedsheet, massive thing, 60 tables of people, and they said that they found it a great compliment that we cared so much about the dialect, which I really like, because they don't often hear that in films. So, yeah.
That's great.
I discovered the same thing with the music, actually. I had no idea really about the Thai music traditions when we started, but the first thing that my musicologist friend, who I became very good friends with actually in Bangkok, she said, listen, you might as well be in a different country when it comes to the musical traditions in the different parts of Thailand, and especially when it comes to song. And that's why we really were, not just the vocal elements, but some of the bowed instruments, the flute instruments, we all wanted to make sure it really was in the traditions of the area, and subtle things, but they make a huge difference.
One of the things that that struck me when I watched the film is like all these different people coming together to create this miracle. And I think about you guys working so symbiotically together also to make this film. When you were making the film, were you aware of this, the fact that, I mean, all these different people from all parts of the world got together to make this happen?
Well, I think it's a huge testament to volunteerism and sacrifice. And for us, you know, we didn't all work together before. Molly and I have been on another Warren Howard picture before, but it was my first time working with Oliver and Rachel and Ben. And Ron's the glue for all of that. You know, he creates such an environment for his craftspeople and his department heads to be able to, you know, express themselves and contribute ideas that are away from the script. And then I think the other thing that may have been an undertone of it was the actual story itself, that what these 13 people could do to endure those 18 days, it's kind of like, well, how are we going to bitch about our jobs? You know, we're in environments that, you know, sometimes we're warm and nice and long hours were long and all that, and I think we're probably decently paid. But it really just kind of gave us perspective from the real story to like the honor of being able to represent their story.
Yeah, yeah.
We were in the mud a lot, just so you know.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that, Molly.
We're so happy. It's such an honor to speak with all of you. Thank you for making the trek over here to. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.